we share and consume information, ever more resilient in the digital age. We explore challenges facing our economy, intersections of technology and society, energy and sustainability, and global order. We're always open for collaboration. Stay in touch with us. Do not hesitate to approach us with your thoughts, ideas, and suggestions. And we promise you that you will hear from us regularly about our ideas and what we do to convert them into reality.
Hello, and good morning or good afternoon in Europe. My name is Mike Carpenter. I am the Managing Director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement in Washington. I am moderating this fantastic panel on pushing back against state capture, which is an important topic that has not been discussed in a lot of these international conferences in recent years, but is critical to understanding the developments in the region. As I see it, the geopolitical trend of the 21st century is one of competition between liberal democracy on the one hand and oligarchic authoritarianism on the other. And the two tectonic plates, if you will, geopolitically speaking, of liberal democracy and of oligarchic authoritarianism are colliding right in the center of Europe, in the region of Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, Bulgaria, and the Balkans. And this tectonic clash is leading to wars, as we saw in Georgia and Ukraine, but it's also leading to a very important phenomenon of state capture, which I will define very broadly as the institutionalization of corruption in the political and economic arenas. It often occurs under the semblance of due process, but state capture really entails the capture, as the word implies, of the judiciary, of the media, of the courts, of law enforcement, of intelligence bodies. This is how would-be authoritarians get a grip on power, and then once they get a grip on power, as we've seen in countries like Belarus and Russia, it is very difficult for that grip to be pried loose. So joining me today are three fantastic panelists who know a lot about the issue of state capture. We have Maya Sandu, the leader of Moldova's opposition party of Action and Solidarity, a former prime minister and a candidate in the upcoming presidential election. We also have Nino Evgenidze, executive director of the Economic Policy Research Center in Tbilisi, Georgia. And last but not least, Brian Whitmore, director of the Russia program at the Center for European Policy Analysis. So I'm going to dive right in, and I'm going to start with you, Maya. You have been Prime Minister of Moldova, and yet your country, in my humble opinion, is the one that has most approximated the sort of quintessential essence of state capture, particularly under oligarch Vladimir Plahotniuc. So if Moldova did in fact witness state capture under Plahotniuc, where does the situation stand today? Is it still one of state capture, or have the institutions of the state gradually become more competitive and more contested by other opposition parties like your own?
Well, first, I would like to say that state capture is much more damaging than corruption. Corruption is an exception to the system. While state capture is the way the system works. And Moldova is probably the best example of a country where state capture happened within a very short period of time, and it came from outside power, because it was not like a person or a group of corrupt people first won the elections and then captured the state institutions. It actually happened before they were in power, and it started with the justice sector when these corrupt people would pay judges, prosecutors, people in other state institutions, and then they built really quickly a system which captured the state. And I would like to give a little bit, a few more details. For instance, when the infamous banking sector fraud happened in Moldova, in an amount of 12% of GDP, and then there was the initial international report on this fraud, we all realized that this fraud happened with the help of the National Bank, of the prosecution, of the Center for Anti-Money Laundering. And this was really scary, and it was a surprise, because we actually believed that we had a pretty decent central bank, independent, and we didn't expect this to happen. And then the next stage happened in the parliament, when the party, which won just 15% of the seats, 15% in the parliamentary elections, in 2 weeks managed to swallow most of the other political parties, most of the other political factions in the parliament, and from this 15% got the majority. And all this was done through corruption, by bribing members of the parliament. And by that time, these people were controlling enough prosecution judges to actually also blackmail such people. And then it didn't take them too long to start acquiring the mayors. So at some point, 80% of all the mayors in the country had to switch sides and to become members of this one political party. And even the political party was actually being captured by this one person, and this was Plahotniuc. It's not easy to dismantle such a system. It was pretty difficult to get Plahotniuc out of the system. But then even when he ran out of the country, for some 3 months, his people in all the state institutions were still expecting him to come back. And unfortunately, 5 months, of course, is not enough to dismantle such a system. The situation is better now in Moldova, but not because the current oligarch, who happens to be also the president of the country, doesn't want to continue with the state capture. It's just that he hasn't been able to capture yet all the institutions. But it has made it easier for us now to oppose the system, and then to find the people within the system who would oppose more resistance. But the danger is still there. We need to get rid of these people soon enough, not to allow them to build back a really fully captured state system.
Great, thank you. And now, Nino, let me ask you about Georgia, because Georgia, similar to Moldova under the reign of Plahotniuc, has an oligarch, Bidzina Ivanishvili, whose wealth really surpasses that of anyone else in the country. And he's also the leader of a political party which has a large majority in the Georgian parliament, Georgian Dream. And so on the face of it, it looks like this is also state capture. Is that the case? Are really the courts, the media, large corporations, and law enforcement all beholden to this one individual, or is the system more competitive than it looks from the outside?
Thank you so much, Mike, for this question. Even in my worst dream, I will never imagine that we're going to speak about today Georgia in this context, you know. Because as you are aware, and our friends in worldwide, the Georgia was one of the best performers among the fighting against the corruption, and being the one of the a driver country doing business, ratings and rankings. But you know, the 21st century authoritarianism cannot be dissociated from the kleptocracy. And as you are aware, the kleptocracy, it's like a 21st century business model where the oligarchs like Bidzina Ivanishvili is trying to get all public institutions under his control. And you underlined this, that yes, he's controlling the justice system. he's controlling all judges and the prosecutors in this country. But at this stage, also he's controlling some media like TV companies and so, but it's still, how to say, fight and very important fight between this oligarchic system and civil society representatives, because until that day, the civil society organizations, they're really doing the great job in terms of to bring all these cases to the public, to explain this to the international level, and to push back them. But still the situation is very bad because as you know, the kleptocracy is like a well-organized elite corruption, and has come to characterize this Russia and in a much post-communist spaces, and it's a main obstacle for our democratic development and even for economic growth. And Bidzina Ivanishvili, as you are aware, he represents this Russian-style oligarchic system in this country, and the Georgian society, we think that he's somehow influenced by the Putin's regime, because whatever he is doing to undermine Georgian democracy, it only goes to the Russian interest. And also where we come now, we came that Georgia is behind the offshore whale. If you look the how to say investment picture where the main investors are coming in Georgia, even the Minister of Finance, he admitted that 70% of these investors, they are Georgian-related, offshore-based investments. And since 2010, 2018, in Georgia, somewhere like a $5 billion billion-dollar investment came from the offshore zone, which is related one single oligarch. And I think it's a disaster. And you know that we're facing now that the elections are coming very soon, end of October, and because of the COVID-19 pandemic situation, I don't know, I think it will be very difficult to get international observers during the election or pre-election times, because that election in October, it's going to be a lakmus or test for the Georgian democracy, because never happened, and we never faced that 3 times someone came to the power. And I believe the Georgian people will try their best to vote and to go to the elections and to make their choices for better and future Georgia, which is going to be not kleptocratic or oligarchic country, but a democratic and developed country, and will be one of the freedom fighters and the democracy leaders in this region.
Thanks, Nino. Brian, I wanted to ask you about Ukraine, but let me preface my question by saying that one of the means by which state capture occurs is usually when the elite or the party in power begins to accumulate resources within the government. They often use that, for example, procurement contracts in Hungary have been a favored method for enriching cronies of the regime. And those cronies then go on to buy media assets, other types of companies that are beholden to the government or do business with the government. And in this way, there's this closely sort of interlocked system of control over the economic and the political arenas. Now, in Ukraine, you had something that approximated state capture, I would say, under Viktor Yanukovych. But since then, you've seen, you haven't seen an end to kleptocracy, and you haven't seen an end to corruption, but you do see that there are different sort of oligarchic centers of power. The media universe, for example, in Ukraine is controlled by On the one hand, Rinat Akhmetov. On the other hand, Dmytro Firtash. On the other hand, Viktor Medvedchuk, and others. And so, what are we seeing in Ukraine? Is it state capture? Was there state capture? Am I wrong about that?
Thanks, Mike. I mean, what I want to do is actually to kind of reconceptualize this a little bit, because I mean, state capture is a term that kind of was coined by the World Bank in 2000 to describe a trend where taking place in former Soviet countries, making the transition from communism, about the systemic political corruption in which private interests unduly influence state decision making. What we're witnessing now goes a little bit beyond that, beyond this initial definition, because right now what we have are private interests in the service of another state, a hostile foreign power, if you will, significantly influence the state's decision-making process. In the former Soviet space and in Eastern Europe, that outside power is, of course, Russia. And as far as Ukraine goes, in terms of both definitions of state capture, the traditional one and the kind of twists that I just added to it, as far as Ukraine goes, there's always been this debate of whether the glass is half empty or half full. The good news in Ukraine has always been that you had, as you pointed out correctly, Mike, oligarchic pluralism, if you will. You've had a competition among different oligarchic groups, and this has translated to a greater degree of pluralism in the political system. Now, the bad news in Ukraine has always been and continues to be that Russia continues to have its fingers in different oligarchic pies, and is always able to have some degree of influence over the political system. You're correct that Ukraine was veering very dangerously toward state capture under Viktor Yanukovych, and it moved away from it to a degree, not entirely, under Petro Poroshenko. Under Volodymyr Zelensky, I am at the moment, and this can change, but at the moment I'm veering towards the glass being half empty right now, because I see a lot of trends that I actually find quite disturbing. A recent audit of Ukraine, and I'm quoting, said grand corruption and state capture remain pervasive and systemic in Ukraine, and no real change can take place without tackling them in depth. Zelensky has been very timid about attempting to say the least, about reforming the prosecutor's office or law enforcement or the SBU. So we have not seen the state reform that we've needed, but also when you're looking at the situation with the oligarchs, you are seeing Rinat Akhmetov's influence increasing dramatically right now under Zelensky, and Russia has historically worked through the Donbass oligarchs. Right now, Akhmetov controls 2/3 of Ukraine's coal power and close to 1/5 of its renewables. And he was influential in steering the state away from nuclear and toward coal and renewables, where, surprise, surprise, he has most of his control. Ihor Kolomoisky, allegedly, according to Ukrainian press reports, allegedly made money by selling coal from Russia and Russian-occupied territories in eastern Ukraine to the state-controlled energy company Centrenergo. So you're seeing even Kolomoisky, who is seen as an anti-Russian oligarch, who has a lot of ties to Russia, and Medvedchuk. You mentioned Medvedchuk, who is of course a pro-Kremlin politician and oligarch. He reportedly has about a 0.25% stake in Ukraine's most popular TV channel, 1+1, according to Ukrainian press reports. Moreover, you see Russian financial institutions like Sberbank and VAB remaining in a very active part of Ukraine's financial landscape, and therefore key vectors of influence. So again, the situation is mixed in Ukraine. The oligarchic pluralism kind of prevents one oligarchic clan from capturing the state in Ukraine. And it translates into a degree of political pluralism, but it also allows the hostile outside power, because we have state capture here. It's another state capturing another state through private sectors, or attempting to. Russia is able to keep its finger in a lot of oligarchic pies, and is playing a very long game in Ukraine, aimed at establishing its goals without even the need for a hot war in the long term. It's able to undermine Ukraine's democratic institutions and prevent it from becoming a fully functioning democracy. So, I mean, going forward, what we need to know about Ukraine is the degree to which Ukraine's oligarchs are still invested in Russia, because like I said, there are two levels of state capture here. One would be a problem all by itself if there were no Russia. But when you add the Russian factor onto this, and this I would add is also, I see this problem repeating itself, not just in Ukraine, but in Georgia and Moldova and elsewhere in Europe as well. So, and I'll be glad to expand on anything.
That's the point you raise. I want to pivot from this point because I want to leave enough time. We have a short discussion to get to the solutions of how you undo state capture. But on this geopolitical point that you've just raised and that Nino touched on as well, in fact, all of you have, of outside powers and principally Russia utilizing state capture to be able to channel its influence into these countries. But I wanted to ask Maya, because Vladimir Plahotniuc was seen in the West as a pro-Western oligarch. He presided over a system of tremendous state capture, as you yourself said, especially with the local officials, with the mayors, who were told, you know, you don't get a new school or a new kindergarten or a new senior center unless you join the ruling party. And if you don't, there will be unmarked cars that trail you 24/7 and intimidate your family members. And, you know, I have spoken to local officials in Moldova who have cried, shed tears in my presence because they've been so stressed out by this pressure that was put upon them. So you have this system of state capture, and yet it appeared to many in the West that it was pro-Western. Was that the case, or was it manipulated behind the scenes in a direction that was not quite so pro-Western?
Well, definitely it was a manipulation by Plahotniuc, but he managed to get some support from some people in the West. By doing so, he discredited the Western model of development and the pro-European way of Moldova, and this was very upsetting. By doing that, he was trying to divide the country and to diminish the resistance against his regime in Moldova. But then at the end of his story here, we saw video recordings where he was negotiating with Dodon the federalization of the country, which is the kind of the solution that Russia is suggesting for the Transnistrian conflict, and is something that we do not accept, which is a proof in the end that what mattered for him was money and power, and it was not about the West or the East. It was about himself and about his interests. But unfortunately, he did use the pro-European rhetoric to try to cover for the abuses that he was making. But what kind of a pro-European he could be when he was just taking people's businesses, putting them in prison, opening criminal files against mayors, arresting opposition and so on. So of course this would just go against everything that the EU and the West promotes. But this made our fight against him more difficult because he was using the geopolitics in his favor.
Great, thank you. So now I want to pivot a little bit and turn to some of the solutions since we have so little time left. So I'm going to start with you, Brian, and then I'm going to turn to Nino. We have NATO, EU countries where we see state capture. I'm thinking of Hungary and Bulgaria as the two primary examples. So if large international blocks of democracies cannot prevent this from happening within their ranks, it would seem that it would be much harder for a country like Moldova, which is sort of nestled between Russia and its influence and yet not fully integrated into Euro-Atlantic structures, to be able to break out of this stranglehold. What can, and I want to turn to some of the local solutions in a second, that's what I'm going to ask you about, Nino, but what should NATO and the EU and the West more broadly, the United States and its European allies, be doing to shape the field so that this doesn't happen?
Thanks, Mike. I mean, this is something I've actually been thinking quite a bit about, and I can go through a laundry list of things like better laws and beneficial ownership, for example, and greater transparency on oligarchic structures' ties to foreign powers, better foreign agent registration laws. But I think, Mike, the root of this problem, actually, we have to go back to the early 90s and the moment of quote unquote victory in the Cold War. And I think the seeds of the current crisis right now were planted at that time. If you go back to the late 80s, early 90s, in the West, the dominant ideology, if you will, was this laissez-faire, neoliberal, Reaganite, Thatcherite perspective that is a legitimate part of the Western. I'm not making a political statement here. This is a legitimate part of the Western political tradition, right? But at that moment, this ideology, this radical deregulation, this radical laissez-faireism, was seen as the ideology which won the Cold War and became the key components of what became known as the Washington Consensus in the early 1990s. This is the ideology we promoted to our new partners in Eastern Europe. And as a result, we deregulated our societies to the point where there were these gaping holes that allowed a hostile foreign power, 2 decades later, Russia, to be able to exploit these holes. So I think we have to have a new conversation about smart regulation with an eye toward national security, because I think we opened ourselves up to this in the early 90s with the ideology that was dominant at the time, which we mistakenly thought was the thing that won the Cold War for us, when in reality what won the Cold War for us was everywhere from Roosevelt on the left to Reagan on the right, the entire gamut. We needed it all. And so I think this is something we have to have a real serious rethink about in the West, and we have to start looking at regulation as a national security concern in terms of public policy, and start thinking about creative ways to do this. There's obvious ways to do it. Better laws on beneficial ownership, for example, is a way to do it. Because this isn't just a problem in the obvious countries in Europe like Hungary or Bulgaria, but you also see it happening in countries which are considered good performers, like the Czech Republic, for example. So I think this is something we have to pay a lot of attention to, even as far west as here in the United States. So that would be the way I would approach that. We have to have a kind of a radical rethink about the paradigm.
Great, thank you, Brian. So Nino, you mentioned civil society earlier, and it seems to me there's a couple different ways to break up state capture, and they all need to sort of be vectors that are working in the same direction. New opposition parties coming to power that break up the structure of old, civil society that pushes from below, and then good laws and governance institutions that prevent some of these things that we've just been talking about for the last 20 minutes from happening in the first place. But tell me about the role of civil society, because Georgia has, to my mind, one of the most active, energized civil societies of any country in the region. And I'm not just talking about the organizations, although those are also impressive, like your own, but also the sort of the people power, the ability of people to turn out in the streets when they feel that something is unjust or the government is doing something unfairly. So talk a little bit about the role of civil society in pushing back against state capture and oligarchy.
Thank you so much, Mike, for these questions, because you know that there is no easy ways to break up this system. And civil society of Georgia, I mean, the like a well-established civil society and media as well, they were doing a great job in terms of bringing this, like, you know, the attention of the international, our strategic partners on these issues. And it's very sad that Georgia came to the first time into the Senate decrees and the statements that Georgian government is not doing well in terms of defending the international, like foreign direct investment, and also the in terms of democracy, they are backsliding. And the role of civil society in this regard was very important, because we ourselves well organized this fight or pushback to the oligarchic system, because we think that this oligarchy is how to say, issue of our national security, and because this undermining the Georgian democracy. To be a democratic country is like a main, how to say, main idea for Georgia, because why our strategic partners and allies loved or supporting the Georgia, because we were always fighting for these values and the freedom in this region, and we were like you know, the trendsetters in this region, and to giving an example to the rest of our neighbors or in the like countries in the region, that if Georgia is going to be surviving this battle, then other countries also will follow us. And if you go to the, like, if you see the last polls or whatever, I mean, the main part of the Georgian society, more than 80%, they are still for Georgia's Euro-Atlantic integration. And this support mainly done by Georgian non-governmental organization and the civil society, because we are just like going everywhere in the rural areas and spreading this information, and not fighting against the Russian disinformation with against the propaganda, but just on time proposing the true. And we think that the role of civil society in terms, again, to pushing back to kleptocratic system or oligarchic system, I'm like very hopeful on this regard, that we're gonna to intensify our like watchdog function during the election or pre-election time. And for us, again, to break up this system is very important to our strategic partners' support, because you know that you cannot deal with the anonymous ownership inside of this small country, because it's a big like systematic problems. And I still believe that world and especially the democratic world should be uniting their efforts to fight against this, you know, the systematic kleptocracy all around the world.
Great. And it's now come time to take questions from the audience. And we've already got one. I encourage other people to submit questions in the chat box. But before I turn to that one question, I want to just wrap up with Maya Sandu and ask you about the politics of this. And just, I'm going to be very blunt. If you do win in November, how are you going to take apart this system of state capture in Moldova? What are the key elements that you would put in place to ensure that this never happens again?
Well, this is about building strong and independent institutions, and this is very difficult to do. We all know. We failed to build a strong state over the last 3 decades, but this is the only way forward. And this is what we tried to do last year in the 5 months that we had when I was Prime Minister, and I had a really good team. But the moment we started to deliver, so the moment we started to promote the right people in these institutions, that was the moment when the oligarchic forces got together again, and then they dismissed the government. The idea is that in the presidential office, you have more time than as prime minister, because the life of the prime minister can be very short. But it's not going to be easy. You have to start, you have to prioritize, you have to start with the institutions that matter the most. And I believe that the most important is justice, because all these oligarchs, they want to control, first of all, justice because they don't want to be punished, they don't want to be stopped. And this is how it happened in our cases. In our case, so it was judges, prosecutors, and this is where we need to start the reform. It's not an easy reform. Sometimes what the international community advises in terms of the legal framework might not be the best for the specific country in the specific situation. For instance, during Plahotniuc's News times, the international community kind of promoted the law and it was adopted, but it didn't help. It is an ideal law on paper, but for our specific situation, even though it said no political interference, prosecutors promote other prosecutors, prosecutors from within the system select the prosecutor general, but Plahotniuc would use, different instruments. He would just go to these people, to the people with integrity, to the prosecutors with integrity. They would just go to his families and then try to, intimidate them and tell them not to run for one position or another. So it doesn't help. But it has to be about this reform. And I know that the EU, for instance, and other institutions, other development partners are trying to help some countries in the region with the justice sector reform. There should be, there should be a more bold kind of attitude because all of us here in the region need to clean up the system. There should be opening for cleaning up the prosecution and the justice, because otherwise we'll never get to have strong institutions. So I would start with the security issues and the institutions which are supposed to provide security for the country, and then with the prosecution, with the justice sector, and then from there it would be easier to move to the other institutions, state institutions, and to make them independent and to strengthen them.
Great, thank you so much. So I understand we have a live question from the audience. I'm going to turn to the studio to have the question asked.
Hi, it's Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform in London. In the old days, the West had quite a lot of leverage because of its financial muscle in these countries. You now have China with the Belt and Road Initiative. Is there a risk that China can basically offer no strings attached financing, and that undercuts the traditional leverage? I think there's some evidence of this already in the Western Balkans, but I wonder whether it's happening also in the former Soviet space, that if you go to the EBRD or others and they say, well, we're going to set these tough conditions on good governance, you simply turn to Beijing and Beijing says, sure, how much do you want?
Who would like to take that?
There have been discussions in Moldova. There have been discussions in Moldova, but I haven't. Sorry.
Go ahead, Maya. Go ahead.
So I was trying to say that.
Oops.
Sorry. It's not happening in Moldova yet. There have been some discussions. In Moldova, the current government has been trying to replace the Western support by Russian support. But the discussion on $200 million has been there for half a year now, and it's not clear whether this is just an empty promise or this is going to happen. So in our case, Russia is being presented as an alternative, not China.
Brian, did you want to chime in?
Yeah,
Okay, go ahead, Nino.
I just wanted to add some a point that, as you are aware, Georgia signed the agreement with China a few years ago, and to get the free trade agreement with China, but still there is no a significant rise of the China investment in our country, and it's the same situation here. I agree with Maya that in Georgia it's also a more dominant is a Russian influence, China influence. It's not, at least at this time, we're not facing this problem.
I mean, I would just add very briefly, as I was listening to Ian's excellent question, I was recalling a conversation I had with a Georgian official some years back when he was describing to me the difference in dealing with the West and the Russians when it comes to finance. And he said that with the West, the magic word is transparency. With the Russians, the magic word is kickback. And as I was listening to Ian's question, I was thinking, what is the magic word with China right now? And I'm afraid I don't have an immediate answer to that question. But I would suspect it's some degree of political control.
Great. Okay, so we have another question here from the audience. I'm going to read it. It's from Andrei Matishak, and it says, in Central and Eastern Europe, we probably know a thing or two about state capture. We were happy to receive help from the U.S., but, and I am being deliberately provocative, he says, watching Donald Trump using the White House like his political prop, maybe we should advise Americans on how to fight state capture, don't you think? And of course, it seems that Trump can be an example for all aspiring state capturists around the world, and he is taking something from their playbooks. Well, as moderator, I'm very tempted to answer this question, but that's not my prerogative. So I'm gonna turn this to you, Brian, and let you answer.
I mean, you know, I wish I can just dismiss that as whataboutism, but I'm afraid in the current environment I cannot. And what happens here in the United States matters a lot. And the example that is set here matters a lot. And I have a hard time arguing with the sentiment expressed by the questioner, and it just goes to show you that the problem of state capture is not something that is just isolated to our friends and partners in Eastern Europe, but is something we have to worry about here. It also illustrates something else to me, and it's something I've always said, is that we in the West need to pay very, very, very close attention to what is happening in the former Soviet states of Eastern Europe, because what the Russians attempt to do there is an example of what they will try to do to us tomorrow. It's always a harbinger. So I think that I find it very hard to argue with the questioner's sentiment. It's something I'm as an American citizen, I'm deeply concerned about. And that this is a problem that is global in nature. It's not just an Eastern European problem. I've long liked to say, and people have heard me say, corruption is the new communism, and we have to be just as vigilant about guarding against its spread as we were about communism during the Cold War period.
But just to push you on this, Brian, this is not something in the United States that is being perpetrated by Russia against the United States. This is homegrown. This is Donald Trump and his entourage who are stacking the courts, seeking to buy up media that are friendly to them and promote them at the expense of others. And it's the use of intelligence and law enforcement agencies for partisan purpose. And you know, there may be a Russia angle there, but this is not something that is being done by Russia. It's being done by Americans.
You're
Is that right,
Mike? And I would argue these two things are not mutually exclusive at all. You can have something that is homegrown, and that the results of that homegrown phenomenon can also benefit Russia geopolitically. Just like the situation in Ukraine, where you have a lot of corruption, which isn't necessarily being directed at Russia, but it results in a dysfunctional system that is geopolitically beneficial to Russia. So I don't see this question of whether something is homegrown or whether it is being exploited from Moscow or from any hostile foreign power for that matter. I don't see these two things as mutually exclusive. I see these two things as happening simultaneously.
Okay, great. Last question here. We have to wrap up in about 2 minutes. This is from Maxim Khilko. It's a question for you, Brian, although I think it's relevant to both Moldova and Georgia as well. So I'm going to have you answer very quickly, and then I'll give final words to Nino and Maya. But the question is this: what can be done in Ukraine and in other countries of the region to turn our oligarchs into normal, strong businessmen who will make our countries more resilient and not weaker under Russian pressure? So I'll start with you, Brian, and then you, Nino, and then Maya, you have the last word.
I mean, I think the answer is both simple and complicated. I mean, you have to establish a system in which the rule of law applies to everybody. And you have to draw and this has often been talked about, draw a line at one point with these oligarchs and say, what you got up until now, we're not going to be digging into the past. From this moment on, you will play by the rules. Now, no Ukrainian leader has ever been able to do that. I had great hopes for Petro Poroshenko, being an oligarch himself, that he would have been able to carry this message, but he was unable to do it. But it's a question of leadership, and I don't see any evidence under Zelensky of this happening in Ukraine. So, but the answer is simple: establish the rule of law for all and enforce the rule of law for all. But nobody has been able to do that up until now.
Okay, we've got about 30 seconds left for each of you. Nino, you first.
I don't believe the oligarchic democracy, you know, and I don't believe that these people can change their totalitarian mindset or Russian like system of thinking, because I still believe that they were damaged so much during this Soviet time, you know, only way and only like a language they know that to kill, to gain, to like a bribe or to kill the people. And I don't think that it's only way to resolve this problem, to set the international, you know, the system fighting against the kleptocratic and oligarchic regimes all around the world. And it's important to develop the rhetoric about this kleptocracy, oligarchy as a cultural and a moral issue, and to extend this Magnitsky Act also to include the all around the world these oligarchs, you know, in terms if they try to taking the state or to be in a state capture position and taking the country.
Thank you. Last word to you, Maya. Once an oligarch, always an oligarch?
Yes, I don't believe in the re-education of the oligarchs either. And in our case, it's not, this is not an issue. We have a few of them. We need to get them out of power. We need to punish them. So there is no discussion about amnestying somebody who stole 12% of GDP just in one shot. This is not the discussion. But as I said, we don't have many of them. We just need to make sure that we take all from power and then that we don't admit that others come and do the same. So the answer is rule of law.
Great. Well, thank you all so much for joining me, and to our audience as well for listening to this session. I want you to all be aware the next session on rising divisions that will change the face of democracy is coming up soon. So stay in your seats and stay tuned for that. Thank you.
Thank you.